broker, consultant, FSO world in the room? Can you guys show of hands here? Okay. So the next session that we're going to be getting into now is very, very relevant to that and many other things that are happening on, yes, you guessed it, Capitol Hill. There's a lot of things that have been happening that the IFA has really been working really, really diligently at, and the best way to do that, of course, is to give to FranPac. Who here that is actually a part of FranPac at all? Can everybody get a show of hands if you are giving to FranPac today? That number is not high enough. So we have our expert in the room. Anna, can you raise your hand in the back? So Anna Russell from the IFA, and then Paul Rocchio from the IFA, and then Emily from the IFA. You guys are all here. If you guys are interested in giving to FranPac, please go to see one of those three people, because this session is going to be very, very relevant to that. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on Mr. Max for our next session. Max, take it away. So yeah, click them on if you guys want to click them on.
Sound good? Yeah, okay, yes. All right, we're good? We're rolling. All right, I saw, sales, marketing. I'm sure this is what you guys have all been waiting for, right? The legal session. This is what really gets people fired up. So, yeah. So thankfully there's there's 1.5 lawyers on stage. We got a recovering attorney here in Drew. But the way that we're gonna do this right now is we're gonna hit probably 3 of the biggest topics right now on the legal side. I'm gonna do the as quick and non-legally as possible, like 2 to 3 minutes summary of each. And then we're gonna give you 3 different perspectives. We're gonna give you the franchisor perspective. We got a last minute franchisor replacement, so thank you, Aaron. We're gonna give you the FSO/recovering attorney perspective. We're gonna give you the franchisee perspective. And if we have time, we're gonna do a little bit of a bonus topic at the end on potential changes to the FTC franchise rule that might be coming. But the 3 things that we're gonna hit are non-competes, joint employer, and broker regulations in general. But before we do, let's do some intros. Whoever wants to kick it off, go ahead.
Sure. Jesse Kaiser. I live in St. Louis, Missouri. Been a franchisee for almost 20 years. The brands I've had over the years, Little Caesars Pizza, Valpak Marketing, OxyFresh Carpet Cleaning, Sport Clip Haircuts, and I have an MSO partnership with Ideal Image Medical Spas.
My name is Drew Chalfant. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Fran DevCo. I'm based in Charlotte, North Carolina for the past year by way of Cincinnati for my entire life. So shout out to all my other Midwestern folk in the room. I'm also a recovering attorney, as Max said. I spent the early part of my career in-house counsel for another FSO/development company. We also owned a number of brands, so I was in-house counsel for franchisors. Then owned my own law firm where I was advising franchisors, bringing them to market, and then advising kind of from first franchise sale all the way through strategic capital injection or M&A exit. And now I'm sitting in the executive side for an FSO, helping brands grow. Awesome. My name's Aaron Harper. I've been in franchising for years. On the development side, recently became a franchisor of a brand called Rolling Suds. So we do residential and commercial power washing, and yeah.
Also, extra shout out to Aaron, who filled in last minute, and joining the team today. And when I said, here's what the topics, he's like, I could talk about all these for hours. So we're all in good hands. My name is Max Staplin. I work for Fisher Zucker. Lane in the back, as who you all know very well. In Philadelphia, I've split my career pretty much equally, about 7 years with Lane's firm, and about 5 in-house with Brightway Insurance, which was one of my clients. Went to work for them. They sold to private equity, stuck around for another year or so, and then just came back to work for Lane about 6 months ago. So before we dive in, want to make this as conversational as possible. We are only hitting a few legal topics. If there are anything else that you want to touch upon, it doesn't have to be on these topics, although happy to do a deeper dive. And feel free to direct questions. I can't technically give legal advice. I have to frequently say this is not legal advice. But you also, probably more importantly than me, if you want to get the perspective of one of these 3 on anything, any challenges you're facing, like how do you get around this annoying item 19 restriction where I want to provide pro formas, things like that. Also happy to touch upon, even if it's not one of these 3. But without further ado, we're going to dive right in to non-competes. When we first met as a group about a month ago, we had 2 firm topics and we couldn't decide on what the third one would be. And then the FTC delivered, I would say, a gift for us, but not really probably a gift for the franchising industry by publishing its recent rule on non-competes, which, if it goes into effect, will take effect in about 4 months. I am expecting a lot of challenges. We are not here to speculate on the success of those challenges, but we are here to talk about what this rule could mean for franchising. So in short, franchisor, franchisee non-competes are not affected. That's the number one thing we have to say. The FTC considered banning franchisor, franchisee non-competes. They decided against it. They may well revisit it, but for now, those are still going to be in place. They're still going to be largely enforceable, though every state treats them a little differently. What they did do is ban employee non-competes across the board. So basically, in 120 days, if you have a non-compete with one of your employees, whether you're a franchisor, franchisee, FSO, any company, that non-compete is no longer going to be enforceable. You can still enforce NDAs, you can still enforce non-solicitation, things of that nature, but if your employee wants to leave and work for another competitor right down the street, they can do so. Not only are they not going to be enforceable, but you have an affirmative obligation to tell your employees that any past non-competes are now unenforceable. You have to let them know they are off the hook from their non-compete. So creating administrative hassle as well as a big change. The one exception is prior non-competes with what are called senior executives. Basically, there's a threshold. They have to be making over $157-something thousand a year. They have to be a true executive in terms of controlling day-to-day policies. Any of those can still be enforced. There will be debates about who's a senior executive and who isn't. But the long and the short of it is, even for senior executives, after this cutoff date, future non-competes are not going to be enforceable. So that's the rule, and now I'm going to turn it over to the group to talk about kind of their thoughts on it, how it's going to impact their day-to-day. Start with Jesse on this one. So first, just talk about how are you using non-competes currently, and how might that change with this new rule?
I'm just kind of curious. Could I get a show of hands? Whose organization has non-competes with their employees right now? Okay. I've never had a non-compete for any of my employees, ever. I never felt the need for it. I'm in an industry where some salon groups do that, and I've got a negative opinion on non-competes for the general part. You know, if you've got a bad salon group and they're chasing stylists out of the industry, they can't go work for another salon. They spent $20,000 or plus more a year and a year's worth of schooling to be licensed to cut hair, and they have a bad run-in with the manager, and now they want to quit, but they can't go do that same thing across the street or down the block for fear of getting sued, right? So they leave the industry. They're just terrified. They just leave the industry. So it hurts the industry in general in that particular case. But here's what I'm seeing. As soon as that happened, and I watch all the Indeed resume alerts for all my markets, there is 2 salon groups that have non-competes. I started seeing all their resumes showing up. All their stylists are looking for other work. So they were holding on to them out of fear. And the state of Illinois has already gotten rid of their non-compete. It's open target. I'm actually going and poaching them. One thing you don't do is you don't walk into a salon and try to take employees, but I will find them on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. I will find out what their phone number is. I will call them. And I know now they want to leave, right? So here's the thing. If it's a real special sauce, you're going to patent or trademark it. Other than that, it's all about execution. It really is. So at least from my perspective, with the type of employees I have, and I'm not just talking about like lower level hourly employees, I'm talking about management and everything. I don't put non-competes in it. If you're the employer of choice, the only time I have people leave my organization, they don't go to the same industry. They leave. They're done with the industry, not because of me. They're just burnt out. They want to try something else. They do not leave me to go work for a competitor because I'm the employer of choice in all my markets.
That's great. And that's a lot of what the FTC was saying. If you read their rules, it's going to increase mobility and basically force people to...
And the reason I raise the hands is, there's franchisors in here that want to hire the top talent. And if you've been holding on to them with a non-compete, they're going to come knocking on those doors. Because the likelihood that you're holding on to somebody because of that non-compete's higher than if you don't have one, right? If I don't have a non-compete and someone's happily working with me, it's because they're happy working with me. It's not because of fear of retribution.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really, really good point, is if you're holding on to talent because of the threat of a sword of Damocles coming down, then that's not someone who necessarily is ingrained in the culture of your organization, like they've got one foot out the door anyway. Quick note on, if you feed Max 2 Old Fashions later, he will give you free legal advice. So corner him at the bar later.
It's a true story.
I've seen it. On the non-compete side, it's not lost on me that, like, reflecting on how have we used non-competes in the past is kind of asking how did they varnish the floors in the Titanic, right? These things are going away. The sky is not falling, though. We've already had, Jesse just mentioned, Illinois has disposed of them. California hasn't had them for years. So we have jurisdictions that have not been allowing non-competes. Business has gone on. Employees have worked at organizations. Is there a little bit of additional froth in the market? Absolutely. So I think it would behoove us to really look maybe at solutions. Like, what can you do to protect your legitimate business interests now that you no longer have the deterrent effect of a non-compete? And a couple things that I would look at. One is non-competition, or the ability to compete does not mean that you have the ability to walk out of an organization with proprietary trade secrets, customer lists, things like that. The question is, have you looked closely at your employment agreements? Have you looked closely at your employee handbooks? Do they adequately define confidential information? Are the things that you want to protect inside of your non-solicit, that they can't walk out with those things? I have a feeling that if everyone in this room went back and looked at some of their HR paperwork, they would be surprised to find out that things that they thought were well protected and things that would be subject to confidentiality and non-solicit clauses are not as buttoned up as they need to be. So now that the deterrent is going away, you're going to need to go back and look at those things and make sure that you have some recourse if someone really does walk out in a bad actor scenario, try to take a client list with them, try to take proprietary material with them. That's going to be your best bet, and that's what you're seeing in places like California and Illinois. The fact that the deterrent is going away, I think you're going to see coming up in September, especially in for this particular community, not that it's not already incestuous enough with the way people jump from organization to organization, but with that deterrent effect gone, I think you're going to see talent kind of migrating away from, to Jesse's point, they're going to go away from bad cultures, they're going to go away from bad management to organizations that more closely align, and they're going to be free to do that.
So just out of curiosity, so in your HR paperwork, can you put customer contact lists are property of XYZ franchise?
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, 100%.
And can you put a value of damages if they were to use it outside?
So the danger with putting a value of damages is now you're saying, you can steal my customers if you write me a check for this amount of money. And so we generally tell our clients, don't put the dollar, because if someone steals it, we want to go and get an emergency injunction to shut that person down right away, rather than a lengthy lawsuit where you're trying to get money at the end of it, and by the time you've gotten your check, all your customers are gone.
Or just make the client list worth more than the revenue you're going to get from it.
Or just make the client, well, then we're going to get into a whole list of what you're actually going to recover in a lawsuit and all that kind of stuff. But the long and the short of it is that's the most important point, is protecting customer information, and proprietary information is going to be key because you can't keep the people in the doors.
So I have an interesting lens on this. When I was a W-2 employee, I just was like, whatever, it's a non-compete, I'm going to go work somewhere else, it's not a big deal. So now that I'm running my company, we have proprietary information on how to clean buildings, and we have kind of proprietary equipment, and the build of our truck is proprietary. And I recently had an executive that I had to ask for his resignation and he was literally up there, and from an executive perspective, made close to $200K a year. And he did a ton of stuff that he shouldn't have done. And then a week later, after asking for his resignation, he announced online that he had gone to work for another power washing company. And I asked my advisors what to do, and some of my investors, and they're like, you 100% send him a legal letter and you enforce the non-compete. So we did, and that company called me and let him go. So I do believe that there is relevance in a specific situation like mine, because he could have, he literally led the trainings that we were doing. And there was a bunch of cause for asking for his resignation. I won't get into it, but you don't have that, and it becomes a challenge, because what's proprietary, what's not proprietary, what customer lists have value, which ones don't. He started reaching out to suppliers. It was brutal.
And there's ways, I mean, I know we do this at Fran DevCo. If someone downloads more than 10 records out of our CRM, there's a notification that goes out. That's not necessarily an action item, but a record is created somewhere that a download has happened. It's an interesting needle that you're trying to thread. You don't want to create an organization where everyone is so siloed off and that it's like, it's like a blacklist campaign where everyone's afraid to move. But at the same time, there are some, and really, just do it with tech. There's tech on the back end that can give you those automated notifications if there's large data exports. There's tech on the back end that can let you know, you can just install it on employee devices and it'll create a record, and you're only going to use it if it's truly a bad actor scenario. It's not as big brother as you think that it is, but as a prudent business owner, I highly recommend that you have some good data controls in place so that you're not scrambling in Aaron's situation. I don't know if this is what happened to you, but you probably had to go back and recreate what does this person have, who have they contacted. Like, you end up kind of doing a pre-litigation discovery of like, how bad is this, what is the fallout. If you put those measures in place on the front end, you know how bad the fallout is. I know if somebody downloaded every record from our CRM and walked out with it because there's a notification in my inbox that on X date, Y number of records was downloaded.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And just from my personal experience, it's going to make life harder for your lawyers to enforce these things because a non-compete was easier. When I was in-house, non-competes were big for our franchisees. It was insurance, so they were insurance agents, and they would go undoubtedly to steal their customers, but they would also breach a non-compete. And when we had to enforce a non-compete, all I'd have to prove is that this person is now working for this other agency that's 5 miles away and selling the same stuff. We had one in a state where it wasn't enforceable, and then we had to do exactly what Drew said. We had to pull downloads, we had to see what they took off our system, we had to build this circumstantial evidence case to try to enforce it. So really, this rule shouldn't impact what is most important to you, as kind of Jesse noted originally, which is protecting your information, but it makes it a little harder for your lawyers to make that case. Before we move on, I got a couple of franchisor perspective questions from Aaron. So first, a lot of franchisors, or at least a lot that we work with, have contractual language. I don't know if they do it, but they require their franchisees to have their key personnel sign non-competes. Is that something that you do or that you care about on a franchisee level? Or is that something where as long as your franchisee key personnel is signing agreements that protect their proprietary information, that's kind of enough security for you? And same thing for Jesse, whether you've actually had a franchisor try to push that on you. So
I think it would make them very terrified of co-employment with that.
Yep.
We do
very
not.
terrified.
Yep.
We do not.
Yeah.
We do not require.
And I can tell you one of the things that we will be doing as a result of actually the next topic, which is joint employer, is a lot of our clients do mandate this stuff, and we now are going to be that exhibit to the franchise agreement is either going to come out or get dramatically watered down because it's hit on the two hot topics right now, which are joint employer, co-employment, as well as having these unenforceable clauses. Last kind of question for the group on this before we move on. Now, the FTC did not do anything with respect to franchisee non-competes, but there was like a nice little 10-page section buried in this 500-page rule where they talked about how they really considered it. And a lot of people said that they should ban franchisee non-competes. A lot of people said they shouldn't. Basically, it came down to a franchisee is an independent business owner. This is more like the sale of a business non-compete than it is the employee non-compete, and that's why they didn't ban it. So I just wanted to get the group's thoughts. What would your reaction be if the FTC just said, we're going to take it a step further, we're going to ban franchisee non-competes?
I mean, if I picked a brand, I got in the brand because I thought it was the most competitive brand to be in, right? The best brand to be in for me. So I can't understand why I would have 30 sport clips and then try to open up Supercuts, which is another great brand, but like why wouldn't I double down on the brand I already have? I'd have to exit a brand before I left. Now, I'm not so hot that there's 2 or 3 year burn-offs, but I mean I understand that too. So it's not a problem for me. I mean, you're marrying somebody, you got to go through the divorce, and you got to wait if you want to get out of it and get into something else. So, you're supposed to be picking the brand that you really want to have. So why have a second brand of the same thing? It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think this issue kind of exists on a spectrum, and I'll bring in another example from the franchising world. Jimmy John's ran into this where they had some pretty severe non-competes for their employees, and these were store-level sandwich makers who were signing non-competes that said they couldn't work anywhere else that also generated like 10% of their revenue from the making of sandwiches. So if you worked at a Jimmy John's, you couldn't get a job at a gas station if they had, breakfast bagels in the front window. The court said that shocks the conscience, it's unreasonable, it doesn't make sense. So on the employer-employee side, that's one end of the spectrum. I think the franchisor-franchisee is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. It absolutely shocks the conscience that somebody could come in, learn your system, build a customer base, hold themselves out in the marketplace as someone who provides these services, and then on Friday have CertaPro on the side of their van, and on Monday have Max's Painting Pros on the side of their van, and go to those same customers. That shocks the conscience on the other side. So I don't have a crystal ball, but I mean, despite the 10 pages of dicta, I don't think that there's going to be any appetite for taking the rule further towards franchise or franchisee non-competes. I hope I'm right.
I would buy a Max's Painting Pros. It sounds great. But yeah, no, I think to Jesse's point, I think the concern on the franchisor side, and I'll let Aaron tell me if I'm right, is not as much going to a competing franchise brand, but I'm going to use this franchise system to teach me how to run the business, and now I don't like a royalty anymore. So now I'm just going to turn it into Max's Painting Pros, change the name, change the signs, and just take the system. And so is that probably what your main concern would be?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that would really dramatically impact the franchise model if they did that. And I mean, to write 10 pages in that about how they thought about it, to me just indicates that they don't fully understand what they're regulating. Because, I mean, like, if you have a franchise agreement that's 10 years that has, you're teaching someone, to your point, to run a business and follow the systems, and then they can just quit one day or pay their liquidated damages and just put a new sign on the side of their truck, like, that's insane.
That was a perfect segue when it comes to the federal government not understanding what they're regulating, because we're going to talk about joint employer. And I don't mean that in the larger sense that this rule, that the new joint employer rule, came from a bad place, or on just an overarching level. There's a lot of political considerations, but the one thing I feel confident saying up here is that this rule did not appreciate the nuances of the franchising model. In the way that it was drafted, in the way that the kind of factors of employment were listed, it really didn't make sense how that could be applied to franchising. And so that's kind of, we're going to focus not on whether a more broad definition of a joint employer is a good thing or a bad thing, but on how it impacts the franchising community. So my quick little 2 to 3 minute kind of overview. Essentially, joint employer means two sets of employers essentially are both found to be the employer of a particular employee or an independent contractor, basically based on that classification. And how this plays out, there's really two areas. There's the Department of Labor, which is not what we're talking about. That's like overtime, minimum wage, that kind of stuff. What we are talking about is the NLRB, which is collective bargaining. And so that really means unions. For groups of people that want to unionize groups of workers, who are they unionizing to collectively bargain with? Now, if there's a finding of joint employers, that means they're bargaining with both of these entities. And so in franchising, that means franchisees' employees collectively bargaining, not just with their individual franchise owner, but now they get to bond with all of the franchisees in the system and in theory collectively bargain with the franchisor entity. And so that's the potential impact of what this rule could be. So joint employer didn't just get invented last year. There's actually been a little bit of a back and forth over the last 10 years or so. I remember in 2015, I was working for Lane's firm, and that was when the first real shot kind of went to enforcing joint employer against the franchising model. Then there was a scale back a few years later, and now it's kind of been a back and forth politically. I'm not going to get into how enforceable the current rule is. It was published back at the end of last year. Then with a lot of support, I guess, from the IFA and others, there was a Senate bill that was meant to overturn it. President Biden vetoed that Senate bill last week. The courts have currently said the rule is unenforceable, so we are not in like a clear area of what the new rule is going to be, and it's probably going to be decided by the courts. But what this new rule did was it greatly expanded the way in which someone could be found to be a joint employer. It used to be that you had to have substantial direct control. So think franchising. If you're a franchisor and you're actually directly controlling the franchisee's employees with respect to the key elements of their employment, you're telling franchisees, here's what you pay them, here's who you hire, here's who you fire, and you're actually actively doing that, you would be found a joint employer even under the older standard. The newer standard expanded this in two key ways. First, indirect control. So it's not you working directly with the franchisee's employees, but you're telling the franchisee what to do and the franchisee's doing it. Not great, but to me, not a huge jump. The big jump was reservation of rights. Now, if you have an ops manual, if you have a franchise agreement that gives you the right to do this, which may only be in under circumstances of default or something really bad happening, but you still reserve that right, you can now found to be a joint employer. And that's kind of a big shift because most franchise agreements and most ops manuals give the franchisor power to protect the brand, even if that means taking action against an employee and not the franchisee. The other area is they kind of define the 7 key factors of employment. Some of them are not controversial, like hiring and firing, setting wages, scheduling. Yes, if a franchisor is controlling this, they're acting like an employer. 2 that are concerning is 1, health and safety. And I forget the exact verbiage they use, but a lot of franchisors are very concerned if there are health and safety issues going on at a franchisee's location, even if it's through their employees. The second is really the manner and means in which they do their job, and I don't know what this means, and I don't think anyone knows what this means, but I know that franchisors care a lot about protecting their brand, and that means that everyone working for the franchisee has to act in a certain way. I was watching the keynote this morning, the values that every franchisee has to, basically display through them, their employees. These are all now things that could be lumped into you being found to be a joint employer. Again, I don't want to make this like a sky is falling moment. There's a lot of fights that are still happening, but the fact of the matter is we've had to work with a lot of our clients to review their ops manuals, to change their franchise agreements, to get rid of that agreement we were talking about earlier that basically mandating that they make their general managers sign a non-compete. And so that's kind of what we're facing right now in this period of uncertainty. And so I probably did too long of a legal ramble on that one, but it's a little more nuanced of an issue. So I'm going to shut up. I want to hear from you guys. How concerned are you about joint employer? What are you doing differently? I want to start on the franchisor side because I think a lot of it is worrying about what you can and can't help your franchisees with. So how big of a deal is it for you?
So it's not a huge deal for me, and I'll kind of explain why. We work in services. The majority of the employees for franchisees are, $18 to $23 an hour employees. And correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of the joint employer, like to have some type of legislation or some type of action taken against a franchisor, the franchisee's employees across multiple states would need to create some type of action towards the franchisee and franchisor, like in a union type?
Yeah, it's a collective bargaining.
Collective bargaining.
Yeah.
So, for me, if I was hiring a bunch of sophisticated, I just don't see that as something that I'm concerned about particularly. Also, this was struck down in Texas court?
Texas courts, yep.
And then, and I talked to Matt about this, but this is my understanding of it, so correct me if I'm wrong. We knew Biden was not gonna.
We knew he was gonna veto.
This was not a surprise. So the rule would need to be proposed in a different way that is more compelling than the way it was struck down, or am I?
We're in this very, very kind of heightened uncertainty. So the Senate bill to overturn the rule was vetoed by Biden. So that's off the table. But the Texas courts have decided that this rule is unenforceable. Now, could another court in California come to a different ruling? Could it then get appealed up to the next level?
Right.
I believe the NLRB appealed the Texas decision very recently. I think it was right at the legal symposium. So we don't know yet. Right now, it's looking like it's not going to come into play. And it's more of a we need to keep our eyes on it situation.
Yeah, now that's my general understanding of it too.
Yeah, there's also the possibility of an administration change coming in as well. So, I think the biggest issue with this over the past decade has been that it has remained an issue for the past decade. The business community will adopt as long as we have some degree of certainty. Let us know what the outer bounds of the sandbox are, and we will play inside of that sandbox. The fact that we're hemming and hawing back and forth, it's really left the franchisors with no good option. It's, okay, if I don't want to be found to be a joint employer, so I'm going to provide as little support to my franchisees in this aspect as possible until we're both joint unemployers until they fail. I mean, it really is. If the notion of buying a franchise is a business in the box, it comes as quite a shock when you discover that the batteries aren't included. If you can't help your franchisees on the HR front in any way without running the risk of being found to be a joint employer, you are undercutting a key component of what franchising is supposed to do. I'm just kind of venting at this point. I don't really have answers or solutions right now.
Very well spoken.
But I mean, it's just the uncertainty is the biggest hurdle that needs to, like, just let us know what to do so that we can adapt and be flexible and come up with business solutions to solve a regulatory and administrative burden that keeps getting punted back and forth from, I mean, it's 3 administrations now. This political football has been punted back and forth. I'm sick of it.
Yep.
I lose very little sleep over this. Very little. I mean, here's the deal. So something tragic comes down, let's just be honest, excuse the French, we'll be all fucked together. Just like COVID during the shutdown, we all got shut down together, right? So it's a level playing field. Put me on a level playing field, I will always come out ahead, period, right? From a franchisee's perspective, like even go back to COVID, you know, I understand the franchisors were really worried about the brand during that time, right? But I remember some of my brands were like hands off. Like Little Caesars, you talk to their franchise reps, they're like, what the hell's joint employer? Why? They're in my store twice a year. They're only talking to me or the manager. They're taking pictures to the owner and their boss, and they're giving you the review and then getting the hell out of there. Because their system is set up that they train the owner and all their interactions with the owner. So there's no joint employment there, right? Because they have good systems and they just hold the owners accountable. And the other thing is, if you don't want to make a lot of money, they always say this, well, you got the store to where you can manage it, couldn't you, right? So if the sales are down, that's where you can manage it. Good for you.
So, I mean, Max, you and I, this was a big topic. We were at Franchise Old Conference last week, or not Old Conference, the Legal Symposium. Yeah. Oh, that's a lawyer joke and an old person joke. Lane, where are you? Hey.
There it is.
And one of the things that kept coming up was that anything that you want to do as far as regulating employee conduct or things that happen at the store level is you got to find a way to tie it back to brand standards. So let me give you an example. How do they say thank you at Chick-fil-A? Or I'm sorry, how do they say you're welcome at Chick-fil-A? My pleasure, right? That is a brand standard at Chick-fil-A. If Jesse walks into one of his stores and he just secret shops one of his own stores and the cashier at the counter does not say hello or goodbye to him in a way that he deems is on brand for his stores, and he gets in that manager's ear and says, I want this person fired, if there's a paper, like, that creates risk for him of joint employer. If he walks in and his brand standard at his stores is, have a great day, is how they say goodbye, and that employee didn't say that, they didn't deliver on a brand standard, he's at less risk for joint employer. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's tying it to a brand standard, whatever that is. If that is, we clean the bathrooms a certain way as a brand standard, that's, Max, you were talking about looking at operations manuals. It's those kinds of things that, I mean, they need a nuanced look by somebody like Mr. Staplin here, a competent franchise attorney.
No, and
I will also say this too. If you run around to your franchisees with Chicken Little syndrome, talking about joint employer, get smart ones like me. Every time you tell me that I should do something and I don't agree with it, I go, that sounds like joint employer to me. They run in the other direction. And it's never the CEOs or the founders because they're smart enough and I have a good enough relationship with them. It's the franchise reps that have been told, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. So they're walking on eggshells every time they walk into one of my stores. And if they say something I don't like, I'm like, that sounds like joint employer. And then the problem goes away. So.
Yeah, well, no, I want to hit on something you guys said from like a solution-oriented perspective, because there are a couple really easy ways to not be, when something like this passes, the first one that is a target is always the easy target. They want to make sure they're going to win, and there are a couple things franchisors can do, and then I'm curious kind of to see how Aaron implements some of this, because the reality of it is not all franchisees are as sophisticated as you are, and some of them maybe want a little bit of help from franchisors when it comes to employees. But the main thing is exactly what they said. Tie it to brand standards and work with the franchisee and the franchise owner. Don't work directly with the employees, and make it clear you're enforcing a brand standard. And if you're ever threatening someone, even in that instance that Drew described, don't tell a franchisee, you have to fire this person. Tell a franchisee, you're in default of your franchise agreement because you're not properly supervising your business. That's how you frame it. You're still conveying the same thing, but you're not actually saying the magic words or stepping in to tell them to fire someone, tell them to change someone's role. So those are a couple key takeaways. And I guess my question for Aaron is, how many of your franchisees do want help with that kind of stuff? I know you got a lot of owner-operators, but ones that aren't, are they looking to you for guidance on managing their employees, sample handbooks, scheduling, that kind of stuff, or has that not come up a lot?
I mean, they want interview questions. They want to know how to, like, we're bringing in people who have never owned a business before in a lot of cases. And so they've maybe never hired anyone before. I guess I go back to like the chance of every single employee across 26 states and 187 locations, like, organizing and creating a union that would jeopardize my business. Like, honestly, I think we just spend more time talking about it than like, it's just it's such like a slim chance of something happening.
And it's one that will get battled over the course. You know, comparing it with the non-compete thing we talked about. If non-competes are banned, they're banned. Like, there's no gray area. Even if joint employers passed, there's still going to be huge debates about every factual circumstance around each scenario. And so I think that's a key part.
I also think it's a bigger concern for like established brands like Sport Clips or like McDonald's, or, you know, you hear things like what's happening at Starbucks right now.
Industry, for sure.
But like, it's just like, it's so far outside my radar that I feel like we just spend more time talking and worrying about it than like, it's almost, I don't know. That's just my perspective of it. So it's not like I'm like Jesse, like I lose very little sleep.
Yeah. One other thing that's powerful about a franchise system is not just the brand and the systems, but the Genius network that's with the other franchisees within it, right? So this doesn't completely skirt all these issues, but if you have really good, strong operators, you need to spotlight them with the other franchisees and have them be a resource. Yeah. I know many, many times a fellow franchisee will be harder on brand standards than the franchisor will, especially if they're sharing the same market. Right? So, and they're also going to be a great HR resource as well. How do you handle this? When you do this, what do you do this? That's peer-to-peer. That's not joint employer, right? Especially if you're not facilitating it. But you can spotlight those people so everyone knows who they should be asking and talking to.
100%. Yeah, that's a great
Yeah,
point.
I mean, I love the idea of franchisees helping each other in this realm rather than, I'll just share a quick war story of in-house counsel at a franchisor. If you feed your franchisees any sort of documentation or any sort of sample agreement or sample manual, be prepared to see an employment contract that is signed with an employee named insert employee name here. They're not going to change anything. They're going to take it wholesale, even if you tell them they've got to go and get it localized with counsel. The easiest way to get out of the way of this stuff is, as Jesse said, identify really strong operators, especially if they're in the same state as one another. Get them kind of iron sharpening iron with one another. That gets you out of a lot of that HR stuff. It gets you out of having to answer the questions of, hey, can you send me one of these? Can I get one of these? They can share those things with one another, and that side-to-side relationship doesn't create the risk of joint employer that the vertical relationship creates.
Yeah, definitely did that when I was in-house counsel and hated it. I had our biggest franchisees for years demanding sample employment documents, and we eventually did it. We contacted an outside firm. They prepared documents. We disclaimed. There was like 5 disclaimers on the front, including the watermark of draft, including you need to have this reviewed by local counsel. I don't want to know if any of them ever did, because I guarantee that they took exactly what we said and just used it.
They did.
That's how franchisees are. But I think that speaks to a larger point, which is kind of goes back to what Aaron said, which is to the extent they're asking, what are some interview questions? How do I find the right employees? We're not saying, even under this rule, that you can't give guidance. You just can't make it look like control. So what we do in the ops manual, we're not rewriting ops manuals when we look at them. We're largely putting a couple sentence warnings at the top of the section on employees that says, the below is recommended based on our experience in the industry. However, you retain sole control over all of the core critical functions of employment and how to manage your employees. And that language, as long as your people aren't actively contradicting it in the field every day, that will give you the protection to show that you're a resource, you're not someone who's controlling. And so that is joint employer, and I, honestly, largely agree with Aaron. I think the non-compete thing could be huge. I think we talk about joint employer more than it's actually going to impact us on a day-to-day basis. But if you're the system that gets hit with it and you get pulled into a collective bargaining agreement, it's going to hurt you a lot, and so that's probably why it's a headline grabber. Last thing I want to talk about today And Drew's been doing a great job with the lawyer hat, but now we're going to put the FSO hat on to Drew. So the history of franchise disclosure obligations has largely fallen on the franchisors. You know, the giant FDDs, the state registrations, all of that stuff. Until very recently, FSOs, I'm going to use the term broker, but it's an all-encompassing word. If you don't like that word, just use whatever word just replace it with whatever word you prefer. Brokers have not been nearly as heavily regulated. There's 2 states, Washington and New York, where you have to register as a franchise broker or franchise seller. In Washington, the franchisor every year has to submit paperwork saying these are the sellers I use. But there has recently been a lot of momentum to increase the regulation around these brokers. And California's proposed bill, which looks like it's gaining a lot of traction and is clearly intended to be the first of many of these states that regulate, the NASA states, as we call them, not the space NASA, but the administrative agency NASA. It looks like they're not just going to require brokers to register, but this bill for the first time is implementing what we're calling a broker FDD, or a broker disclosure document, where if you're selling a franchise and you're a broker, you need to provide certain disclosures, not nearly as intense as an FDD, but definitely, a lot of things, including litigation history, including compensation terms, things that brokers did not usually have to share will now potentially have to be shared with franchisee prospects, potentially have to be registered with certain states. It's going to increase compliance and administrative costs and really change the dynamic, because it also can increase liability, because these laws will also, if you sell a franchise and you don't give this document, or if there's something not accurate in this document, or you misrepresent something, all the kind of stuff franchisors deal with their FDDs, brokers may now get tagged with that as well. And so really this could be a new world where you see a lot of brokers either adapt or totally kind of have to focus on a different industry, because once you're stuck with a bad litigation history and you're waving it at every franchisee's face, that's going to impact your sales ability. So from the FSO guy first, do you think this is a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? Is Fran Devco worried about it? Are you already calling lawyers to help you with your disclosure documents?
No, I mean, well, first, the acronym for it is absolutely fantastic. It is a UPTFSDD,
Right.
a Uniform Third-Party Franchise Seller Disclosure Document. That rolls off the tongue, right?
Beautiful.
So, a couple things. I mean, one, the sky is not falling quite yet. It is a Senate bill in the state of California. IFA is behind it. The theory was better to be regulated by people who know us rather than regulators who don't know us. I think that this Senate bill is probably the opening salvo. It's still going to be subject to amendments. I still think there's going to be some clawbacks. There's some I will say that if this were to pass today as drafted, there are some pretty nasty provisions in there as far as where liability falls. And I think there are some pretty, I won't call them nasty provisions, but they are definitely a very, very large increase in the amount of transparency, largely in the compensation model for how brokers are compensated, how franchise sales organizations are compensated. I honestly think that is a little bit easier to overcome. I think the liability piece is where you're going to see some brokers exit the space. And I mean, call this controversial. I think that it's probably time. I mean, there was a question that was asked at the last panel, and it was, what was something that surprised you when you first got into franchising? And when I got my head around the fact that any of us, by the time I finished this sentence, could become a franchise broker with an email address and a picture on a web page somewhere, and could go and ask somebody to leverage their personal residence, personally guarantee a 10-year lease obligation, and take out $1 million SBA loan with no education, no licensing requirement, and very, very little recourse is fucking crazy. I mean, that we talked shocks the conscious. I mean, that is a little bit crazy to me. So I think the other side of this that I'm optimistic about, though, is I don't see anything changing in the demand curve here. So if you're in the franchise development space, if you are a franchise consultant or broker, if you are willing to go through, there's going to be a heightened bar for compliance. You are going to have your own probably franchise attorney to help, or an attorney help you do some of this. You're going to have to do some additional bookkeeping and record keeping, and you're going to have to be prepared to discuss the value add that you bring as part of the commission that you're going to be paid. But I don't see the supply side of this. I mean, the supply side is going to go down. I don't see the demand side going down at all. So these brokers who are willing to stick with it and the FSOs who are already above board and on the up and up, it's the phrase that keeps being used, and I've heard you say it, Aaron, is, I mean, the cream will rise to the top here. So to the extent there's a bit of a culling of the herd, or the people who are maybe the weekend warrior, somebody used real estate agent as a good analogy for brokers. The people who like got their license because they want to save 3% on a couple houses a year that they're going to sell, those weekend warriors are probably going to wash out, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, I don't see the demand curve changing, so there's going to be the same amount of fish in the river, just a few less lines. That means you're going to end up with more fish in your bucket if you're willing to play by the rules and jump in.
This is going to be controversial, but can we talk about why this rule is happening?
Sure.
Yeah.
Why the IFA is supporting it?
Yeah.
The reason that the IFA is supporting this bill is because we have a sector of the industry that's overselling and harming the industry. And that's a gross generalization, and I want to be clear, like, I do my business in the broker community. I've grown multiple businesses through brokers, and some of the most wonderful people that I know in this industry are brokers. Like, they know my kids' names, we're family friends, like, they'll come visit me. But there are business models designed where the franchisor and the franchisee do not have the money to grow their business properly. And it is an entire sector of the industry. And there's no accountability whatsoever if 1,000 units are sold or if 600 units are sold in a condensed period of time. And so that falls on the franchisor from a liability standpoint when responsible franchising starts in the franchise development process. That franchisee decides to join a brand because of the interactions that franchisee had in the franchise development process. There's also such an amount of leverage happening right now in that space because franchisors don't know how to sell franchises. Like, when they join the franchise system, like when they join the industry, they don't know how to sell franchises, they don't know how to find franchisees. And I saw a stat, 80% of the deals that are done in the broker community right now are through franchise sales organizations. And so the franchise sales organizations can say, we don't take you on unless we can say you can work 5 hours a month. We don't take you part of our system. Or unless you're willing to sell your business as absentee or semi-absentee, you can't be part of my portfolio. And I know this because of the content that I put out. Those franchisors come ask me if that's normal. So, like, I want to just be clear before we, like, talk about the rule and, like, what our opinions are on it, that we all are completely aware of why the IFA is supporting this bill.
No one ever volunteers for more regulation unless they think they need it. I mean,
And what the IFA is trying to do with this rule is regulate it internally, because if we don't regulate it internally, we're going to let a regulating body that has absolutely no idea who the stakeholders are set the terms. And so the terms of the rule as it's currently written, and correct me if I'm missing anything, is basically anyone who's involved in the sales process, whether it's an FSO or broker, would have to disclose the brands that they've sold, how much compensation they've received from those brands, any litigation or issues that have happened as a result of those brands. What else am I missing?
those are the main points. There's like a list of 10 or 11. Great article on franchisors.com if you want to see the full list.
And they have to list every single franchisee they've ever placed in any of these brands, just like an item 20 that a franchisor has. So a prospective franchisee of a brand could review that broker FDD or that FSO FDD, call all of those franchisees, ask them how they're doing, and then just decide which organization to work with based upon that. And we've had, especially in the last 5-6 years, we've had some lawsuits that have predicated this rule being proposed. And if we didn't set the terms, they would have been set for us. So I just want to make sure, like, everyone is fully aware of, like, why this is happening, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense to talk about the opinions around it.
Do you think it goes far enough?
I think that the compensation piece, to your point, and I think that they could probably do some type of percentage based, But if you're a broker or a franchise sales organization and you sell a ton of units and that franchisor ends up in a ton of lawsuits, you're the one who walked them across the finish line. You're the one who set the expectation. You're the one who did the unit economics call where you plug in the number. I mean, this is standard, guys, right now. Like, let's just be like super clear. The big organizations are doing this. It is the second call that they do. And they're largely using item 19s that are not based on an absent or a semi-absent model. So like, it's not good, guys. Like 20 years from now, if we keep doing this, like, we're fucked. So like, I do think that where we're at, like, we're on a pretty far pendulum, and I feel like where we need to go is maybe not how the rule's currently written, but we absolutely need to have some type of term setting that we say in the industry, these behaviors are irresponsible. We do not think this is okay. We think that if this continues, it will harm our industry, and therefore this is what is responsible in the franchise development process. And that is why I proposed the 4 core tenets of responsible franchising, which is setting clear expectations, making sure franchisees and franchisors have the right amount of capital, and growing sustainably. Don't sell more units than you could feasibly open. Like, these are things that I believe are objectively like good actions. But the way the financial model is structured in this sector of the industry, it doesn't set franchisees and franchisors up for success.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think, are we out on time? Good on time? All right, let's go.
So my brother and I last year, we went on a magical mystery tour, and we just, like every other week, we're going to Discovery Day, right? We were looking for another brand. We're driving or flying every other week. So here's my experience with FSOs. They're not all created equal, right? So 2 different FSOs. I won't say the brands or who the FSOs were, but I will tell you one scenario. So we had gone through some, like, we had some conversations, and they were like, you should come to one of our town hall meetings for prospective franchisees. So it's a Zoom thing. The guy's getting up there, and he's got the wrong background for the different brand. And he didn't recognize it for like 30 seconds, right? We're like, oh my God, what the hell? The other one was, we were like, this guy's good. I think he actually works for the corporate office. But when we were setting our Discovery Day, we had to fly out there. It was on the East Coast, one of the Carolinas. Well, he had told us where they were based, and then we were getting plane tickets based on the address they gave us for a different Carolina. So we're like, we got the addresses right. Oh, that's another brand. Sorry, it's like you were going to ship us to a Discovery Day that wasn't even for the brand we were talking to you about. So just be careful and audit your FSOs and make sure they're doing a good job, because so many times we're just like, this dude is reading the same script no matter what the brand is, insert brand name here, blah, 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 blah. And as a sophisticated buyer, I just didn't even go to those Discovery Days. Those were 2 Discovery Days I didn't even want to go to because of that. So I don't use a broker. I've never used a broker. Our first brand was Little Caesars. We called them up, and we were like, hey, we want to be a franchise. What does that take, right? And we just call. Brokers are great, don't get me wrong, but sophisticated franchisees, they're not using brokers. And there's a couple reasons for that. If I'm going to pay a franchise fee, I want support with that. So if I'm giving you the money, I want that service back. If I know that 100% of that plus some went to a broker, you're broke. How are you going to support me correctly, right? So that's one thing about that. I'm not against brokers either, but I'm just saying, as a sophisticated franchisee, I can call and just talk to the franchise development people and ask questions that I want answered. I don't need someone to hold my hand.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak from the perspective of just how do we at Devco keep an eye on, like, is this something that we should be continuing to sell, or is it time to throttle back? I mean, if a brand comes to us and they have aspirations of 100 units this year, 150 units this year, we'll just let them know that we're not the FSO for you. Like, we're gonna do if anyone were to come up and ask what our model is, I'm going to tell you we're going to strive to do 2 deals a month at an average of 2 units or 2 territories per deal as just a baseline number. That puts you at about 50 for the year. That's not going to work for everybody, and there's a good chance that we might throttle that back midway through the year. There's also a chance that we might throttle that up a little bit if you show us that you have the wherewithal to support it, or if it's a brand that's coming onto a platform where the infrastructure is already there. For us, we are constantly pulsing with our brands, not just on, hey, here's the sales pipeline, here's the sales numbers. We are checking in who's getting open, what do grand openings look like. We are keeping a really good pulse on validation, because if validation starts to drop off, the idea is not, well, let's get these people out of the validation process then and only get good people who are going to sing our praises. It's, hey, there might be something wrong here. If we continue to press on the gas while validation is poor, we're increasing your risk, we're increasing our risk, and we're increasing the risk that we're going to be taking, like, to the point someone else made earlier, someone's entire 401k that they've rolled forward and asking them to commit to something that we're starting to get a bad feeling in our stomach that maybe it's time to pull the dev throttle back a little bit. That's what we do at DevCo, at least.
No, thanks, guys. And I think that kind of an overarching kind of note that I had in going through this is one of the benefits of this panel was not just franchisee, franchisor, FSO, but the different viewpoints on each of these things. I think if you read what's out there, you would assume that this would have been, we all need our non-competes, joint employer is evil, and don't make the brokers do disclosure documents, and that's not at all what was said. We got a lot of different nuanced views, and so appreciate the panel. As Drew said, after a couple old fashions, you can get some free legal advice out of me later. But otherwise, thank you all for bearing through the legal portion of the day. Thank you guys a lot for doing this.